Hello, welcome to this session this morning. We're going to talk about, in the national portion, this is the common law, leasehold estates. Okay, remember there's two types of estates we've visited before. One is called freehold estates, or free man's holding. That's ownership. This one we're going to look at is called leasehold estates. Okay, my name is John Enzing. I'm a certified real estate instructor. I'm licensed in Louisiana and Florida. My specialty is one-on-one private tutoring with you, the student. Okay, I want to prep you for the exam so you can pass it the first time. If you need some help, go to privateturingsession.com. That's privateturingsession.com and schedule an appointment. Go ahead and email me at john.enzing@gmail.com. All right, let's get started. Here we go. Leaseholds. Listen, let's circle back. There's a term you want to understand, a concept you understand when it comes to common law and ownership. What does estates in land mean? So the term estates in land is the degree, quantity, and nature of your interest in that real property. Okay, you remember it's defined in common law as real property. So let's take a home, for example, since that's the business we're in, selling homes. The estate and land would be the degree, quantity, nature of my interest in this property or this home that we're using as an example. I can own it, which is called freehold, or I can lease it, which is called leasehold. They both define an interest in this home, okay? Some have a higher degree of interest than others. And in this session, we're going to talk about leasehold estates. Okay, so leasehold, and we're kind of familiar with the street name, street logo, or terminology as rental property, right? So when we refer to leasehold, we're talking about a tenant's right to possess this property in terms of rent only, okay? That's called equitable title. It's a possession only, okay? So we're not talking about ownership in itself of the property. Someone else owns it. They're leasing it to you. You're the tenant, and you have the right to possess the property as possession only, okay? Now, let's look at the four different types. Listen to me carefully. Four different types are the principles behind leasehold estates. First one is estate for years. The second one we're going to look at is called periodic estate, or you may see it on the state exam, periodic tenancy. The third one is an estate at will, and the last one is an estate at sufferance, okay? Estate at sufferance. You want to know these four for the state exam. Now, what is estate for years? Very easy. Don't confuse this because it's got the word years in it. We're not talking about a year's lease, although it could be. It could actually be years, months, days, weeks, days, or even a time frame, hours within a day. As long as there's a start and an end time, it's called an estate for years. So we're familiar with this on a 6-month rental. Starts December 1st and ends June 30th, for example. Could be a year lease, could be 3-month lease, could be a 1-week in Destin, Florida on a condominium lease. Regardless of the time period, you got a start date and an end date. You're out after that, okay? So really there's no notice that needs to be given to the landlord because that's given in the end time of the lease, okay? That's called an estate for years. The next one is periodic estate. So periodic estate is period to period, okay? So for example, month to month rental, okay? So typically the way this works is you may have a 6-month lease with a tenant. And then say at the end of 5 months, there's 1 month left. So you and the tenant get together and the tenant says, you know what, I may need to get an extension. Say, look, why don't we just go to a month to month, or we'll transition to a periodic tenancy or a periodic estate. We'll just pay month to month. Okay, notice does have to be given, okay, in this tenancy, all right? Remember, estate for years is defined by an end date. So there really is no time, no consideration to give to exit the lease itself at the end because the date's already on the contract. So if it goes from an estate to years to a periodic tenancy, or it could be a periodic tenancy up front, you could just write out a lease period to period. Notice has to be given to vacate at that point. And then we have an estate at will. There is no time period, none whatsoever. This is just between the landlord and the tenant, forever how long they want, can cancel at any time, but you got to give proper notice, okay? And then estate at sufferance. This is when there's no rent paid, no rent, and you're holding over, okay? So the tenant is holding over with no rent paid. This is where eviction process begins. Pay attention to me carefully. You may get a test question that says, out of all the estates in land, remember, degree, quantity, and nature of interest in real property, whether it's freehold or leasehold, out of all the estates in land, remember, freehold is fee simple absolute, fee simple defeasible, life estate. Then you got estate for years, periodic, estate at will, and estate at sufferance. Out of all those estates or interest in property that someone has, which one would be the least of tenancies? And it's going to be at sufferance, because there is no more interest in the property because they haven't paid anything. Okay. Now, the one that holds the highest is going to be fee simple absolute. Okay. Fee simple absolute gives you the full range of ownership of property. It's the highest and best recognized by law. Of the estates, the least is going to be estate at sufferance. That means the person that's in that property hasn't paid rent. So there is no interest in that property. Okay, so you may see a question like that. Now, let's move on and look at types of leases. Okay, those were the types of leasehold estates, the principles behind leasehold estates. Now let's look at some types of leases we can write up to for tenants to stay. The first one's a gross lease. Okay, think of the word gross, like gross pay in a paycheck. Nothing's taken out. It's just one big lump sum. Okay, so net lease is going to be not a gross, but it's going to be a net. And then you got a percentage lease. Okay, and we're going to talk about that when it comes to a percentage of the business income. And then an index lease is tied to an index. We're going to talk about that. So a gross lease, we're looking, the landlord's going to pay for everything. Okay, the landlord pays all the expenses. You as the tenant pay one lump sum. For example, you rent a condo, fully furnished, in town, $1,500 a month. They pay for electricity. They pay for cable, Wi-Fi, trash pickup. All the expenses are paid by the landlord, and you as the tenant are paying one gross lease. Okay. Now, a net lease, you're going to pay a lease. It's a reduced lease because now you're going to take over the payment. So instead of $1,500 a month on a gross lease and the landlord pays everything, you may pay $900 a month. And then you put all the utilities in your name. Okay. So that's called a net lease. And then a percentage lease is going to be a fixed rate rent, but typically at the end of the year in commercial business, they'll take a percentage of the annual profit that's made on the business. Okay. Whatever agreement between the landlord and tenant is. So it's going to be a fixed monthly rent. And at the end of the year, whatever profit the tenant made in the business, a percentage of that goes to the landlord. It's called a percentage lease. And then an index lease is tied to an index. For example, the Consumer Price Index, CPI. That's what measures inflation. Okay. So in other words, if the CPI index rises every year a certain percentage, you tie your lease to that index. Okay. So let's say, for example, if I own a commercial building and you want to rent it from me for 15 years, well, you wouldn't come in and do a net lease, and I'm going to make up a number here, $2,000 a month for 15 years, because over 15 years, the cost of inflation goes up. And eventually, me as a landlord, I'm going to start losing money towards the middle, maybe, and towards the end of the lease. My costs are going to have to go up to maintain the building, but I'm only collecting the same rent. It'll work at the beginning because it matches inflation. So what I'll do is I'll tie your lease to an index, and I'll say to you, we're going to start out at 2,000 for the first year. And then every year subsequent for 15 years, it's tied to the CPI index in its adjustment. So if the CPI index goes up 1.5%, so does your rent. So it maintains with the index, it maintains with inflation, so the landlord never will lose money. Okay, that's called an index lease. Okay, it's tied to some type of index, and typically it's the CPI or the consumer price index. And listen, I hope you enjoyed this little short session on Leasehold Estates. Again, if you need some additional help, go to privateturingsession.com, privateturingsession.com. Look, best wishes on your exam. Bye for now.